next speaker. Sheila Crowley, National Low Income Housing Coalition, former president and CEO, will be our next witness.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for the invitations from Senator Sanders to be here today. It's been really interesting to listen to all the other speakers. You all have a great challenge in front of you, but I think that the values that we all share will guide you in coming up with what should be a very powerful platform to take our country forward. I recently retired as the president and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I'm here today as a private citizen and can actually say out loud, as a proud Democrat in this environment, I do want to acknowledge that the National Low Income Housing Coalition has friends on the committee, and that Representative Lee and Representative Ellison, as well as Senator Sanders, are recipients of the National Low Income Housing Coalition's Edward W. Brooke Housing Leadership Award. So we feel very excited about the potential for a good housing agenda in the platform. I'm going to focus in very specifically on the issue of housing for very low-income people. Housing is a very broad agenda, but this is one that I'd like to take my time here in front of you to focus on. Having a secure home to which one can return at the end of the day is fundamental to human existence. Yet, like so many other aspects of the American economy, housing is riddled with inequality. Housing policy and housing finance favor the better off. Eviction, foreclosure, housing poverty, homelessness, substandard conditions, unfair lending, and illegal discrimination are experienced by Americans, millions of people in the United States every day. We can do better. In 2014, there were about 43 million renter households in the United States, and 37% of households are renters. About 25% of that group are people that in housing jargon we call extremely low income, about 10 million households, roughly equivalent to the federal poverty level. There were 10 million of these households, but only 5.8 million rental housing units that people in this income group can afford. It is the only income group for whom there is a shortage of housing in the United States, and it is where we need to focus our housing investments in a very laser-like way. Because some of these units are actually occupied by higher income people, we actually have a shortage of 7.2 million rental housing units for the lowest income people in our country. This is the problem we would like to solve. I'm going to share with you the latest report from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, which will give you more complete data about this. The result is that extremely low-income people are highly cost-burdened. 88% of extremely low-income renters pay more than 30% of their income for their housing, and 75% pay more than half of their income for their housing. And when you're very poor, that's a very high number. Faced with untenable high housing costs, people seek out more income with second or third jobs or resort to extra legal means to satisfy the landlord. They forego heat or food or medicine. Any disruption in pay, a sick child, car trouble, can upend even the most carefully planned budget. Non or late payment of rent looms large every month and is a source of unrelenting stress. And when you can't pay the rent, you are faced with eviction. Your choices are then moving in with somebody else to live in overcrowded conditions. Eventually, you end up in shelters or on the streets. Housing poverty, residential instability, and homelessness have serious consequences beyond just the housing issue. Education is disrupted as children churn through schools. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday about a school in New York City where 47% of the children in that school are homeless. You could go to any principal at any school in this country today, and they will be able to identify homelessness amongst the children in their school, and it is a problem with which they are grappling. It's not just education, it's healthcare. Pediatrician Megan Sandel calls decent and affordable housing a vaccine that would benefit both individual people as well as the communities. And then, of course, a stable home is a precursor to any success in the workforce. All of these things that we wish for the people in our country depend on the foundation of a good home. And if we don't take housing seriously and address that first, we're going to be in trouble. Unlike food and health care, to which one is entitled in the U.S. if one's income is low enough, housing for low-income people is not an entitlement. Because of funding limits and because the HUD budget is funded through annual appropriations, only 25% of the people who are eligible for housing assistance in the United States actually receive that low-income housing assistance. The total federal investment in low-income rental housing, including through the tax code in FY16, is about $50 billion. And most of these dollars go simply to maintain the existing housing system that we have and do not make a dent in the shortage of 7.2 million units. Let me contrast our investment in low-income housing with the subsidies that go to homeowners through the tax code, and it predominantly benefit high-income homeowners. Let me point out that these benefits are, in fact, entitlements, because if you are eligible, you receive them. You don't have to wait in line for them. The combined value of the four major tax breaks for homeowners, according to the OMB, is $253 billion will be in 2017. The mortgage interest deduction alone costs $69 billion and subsidizes mortgages up to $1.1 million. We don't need to be subsidizing million-dollar homes. I urge that in the draft, as you draft your platform, that you include in there the ways to provide for a robust and balanced housing policy, and that housing policy take a central role in addressing poverty and all the other problems that you are hearing about today. I have several recommendations in my draft, in my written testimony, but let me focus specifically on the National Housing Trust Fund, which we would urge that be included in the platform and be funded with a robust at least $5 billion. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions. Are there any? Yes, Deborah?
Yeah, I just wanted to, again, thank you for being here. And I was creating the list here, and I'm looking at sustainable housing as being very important. So we can go across the America and look at reservations that have HUD housing, and you can see examples of housing developments that weren't built appropriately and with such low costs that the heating, people cannot afford heating. So that's another issue that we have. But if we look at sustainable housing, green energy, then I think that's a better route that we can go to. So I'd just like to
I've been to Indian country and seen the housing conditions there, and it's really extraordinary. Let me just say that one of the funding sources proposed for the National Housing Trust Fund a couple of years ago in the housing finance reform bill that didn't go forward had a set aside for housing for the Housing Trust Fund in a set aside for Indian housing, which we were very, very pleased about and would encourage as you look at funding for housing that you look at further set asides for specifically focusing on the housing conditions in Indian country. We know that part of the problem is that our housing data does not tell us the story about what's going on in Indian country because the American Community Survey does not do as good a job in understanding housing and community conditions in Indian country as it does in other places. And so you have to really pay extra attention to how you're going to address it in Indian country.
Thank you. Carol Browner?
Thank you so much. Two questions. One, the opportunities for, as we build low-income housing, to do it in a way that doesn't produce pollution, that doesn't contribute to the carbon pollution. Is that something you all have thought about to make it, green, if you will? And then secondly, there's been a lot of discussion and various candidates have put forward ideas on infrastructure. Why wouldn't we make building affordable housing part of an infrastructure plan? We talk about we talk about bridges over rivers, we talk about roads, but why wouldn't we put housing into an infrastructure?
In answer to your second question, yes, it should be included in an infrastructure agenda. Just like schools and other things that are essential to community and individual well-being, we really have to talk about that. And there have been some proposals to do that. On the question of green building, there's a great deal of technology that's gone into doing that, a lot of innovation. A lot of people in the affordable housing field are paying very close attention to that. One of the problems is that in our existing federally assisted housing stock, public housing in particular, is that we have such a backlog in capital needs in public housing that it's really difficult for there to be the ability to save money and to do a better job on energy conservation in public housing. We really need to, public housing is a precious resource that we should be preserving, but we also need to improve it and make it ready for the next generation in a way that is sustainable.
So just one quick thought. You know, a lot of times in certain communities, the issue of lead in public housing is still quite acute. And one of the sources of lead poisoning for children is the windows. When they're opened and closed, the dust that collects. You can replace old windows with energy efficient windows and solve the lead problem. But I think sometimes we don't think about those.
Well, all this investment in housing that goes to rehabilitating existing housing should be bringing it up to current standards and dealing with
And
lead.
beyond.
But if people are still living in old substandard conditions, then there's a whole host of health problems that are associated with that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like